Hello and welcome to the Niagara Pump House Art Center Care Kit video for April. This month we're going to explore all different kinds of weaving techniques. So let's get started by first going over all the materials that we have laid out in front of us. So to begin with, we have a piece of cardboard. This is going to be our loom. So it's a very simple device. Like I said, it's a piece of cardboard. You'll see the front of it has these two sort of bridges. They're called bridges attached to the front of the loom. And then it has a bunch of these little notches on either side. This is going to hold our thread as we start weaving. We have a couple of different pieces of yarn in front of us. We have our first one, this fine yarn labeled warp. This is going to be the long threads on our loom. We have two threads labeled weft. These are going to be the threads that we work weaving in and out of our warp, and these will be the horizontal threads that sit across our loom. We have a selection of these sort of variations of colors of this big chunky yarn, and we're going to experiment with some different textures and techniques with that. And lastly, we have a little tiny piece of cardboard cut into sort of an oval shape with some notches. This is going to be our shuttle, and it's going to help us move our weft through our warp. So now that we have all our materials down, let's get started. So to begin our project, we're going to start with our warp thread, and we can just take off our little label and set that aside. So traditionally the warp thread is the long vertical threads that run through any piece of fabric. And to attach this thread to our loom, what we're going to do is we're just going to find one end of the thread. We can take off a little bit. And so we're going to find this very first notch on our loom. And what we're going to do, I'll flip it over, is with leaving a little bit of a tail or a little bit of an edge, we're going to take our thread and we're going to pull it through this first notch till it's sitting all the way up at the top. So as you can see, my thread is starting at the bottom left-hand side of my loom. And what I'm going to do, you don't have to worry about pulling anything terribly tight. You want good tension, but you're not going to be pulling so hard as to pull your thread out of your first notch. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take it and bring it, my warp. I'm going to bring it all the way up to the top and slot it through the top there. And then just to flip over to show you, I'm going to take my thread, I'm going to put it right next to it, and I'm going to just cross over that second notch here, and then bring it back down. And I'm going to keep repeating the same process. So I'm going to go up, across one, down, across one, and keep doing that. And just take your time with this, just making sure that you're going up, slotting in, moving across, slotting down. And we're going to keep going until the entirety of our warp is used. Remember, keep slotting that thread in that little cut that's directly above the one you're working on. And so when you're all finished, I'm almost done here. What you're gonna have your loom look like. So from the front, it'll look like this, all properly strung. And it's important to note from the back that all of these pieces, you're not having any long strips on the back. You're just having them cross over each little tooth. And if, like me, you have an area where your warp is a little loose, that's okay. You can go and you can give it a bit of a pull, and you can pull it till it's taut at the end. And once I'm happy with all of my threads being nice and tight, so this is what the front should look like. I'm going to flip it over, and this is what the back should look like. Don't worry about these little tails hanging. Once we're finished, I'll show you how to tie off your thread on your loom. and these will get tied up, but you have successfully put your warp on your loom. And so we can move on to the next step, which is getting our shuttle loaded with our weft, and we will begin weaving. So our next step is going to be selecting one of our weft colors. So you can make the choice to either go with this sort of creamy white or this lovely rich orange. I'm gonna start with orange. So you can just take this, again, just take that little label off. We can set it to the side. And so, like I said in the introduction, this is going to be our thread that is woven horizontally, or tabby wove, through our warp. And there are two ways to achieve this. Normally what I do is I will do this by hand, weaving the thread in and out, but we also have the option of using a shuttle. So this is just a little piece of cardboard, and what you can do is just take a little bit of the yarn at the top of the shuttle. You have a little bit of a slit, and you can put it through the little triangle at the bottom, and then maybe do this once or twice. And this will help you if you're having problems moving the thread through with just your fingers. The shuttle can help you pick up and put down some of these threads. So that's the way we load our shuttle. To begin with our weft, so I've picked up one end and I've loaded it onto the shuttle. And what I'm gonna do is I'm just going to find the other end of our thread. Now, I've been pretty generous in providing a lot of material for our warp, or excuse me, our weft. So if you have too much at the end, that's okay. You can always take a pair of scissors and cut off any excess. But what I'm gonna do is I found the other end, and I'm going to take that and I'm gonna slot it through just like I did with the warp. So I have a nice secure beginning. And then what I'm gonna do, I'll take, normally I like to work left to right with my weavings, but whatever you feel most comfortable with in terms of, if you're more comfortable working right to left, then by all means. So I have all my excess thread here, and I'm gonna start with my shuttle. So I'm not gonna start right down here along the bridge because it's gonna be really hard to move my shuttle up and down. You'll notice the bridge is going to lift the warp just up off your loom, and that's gonna give you the space that you need to move it back and forth through your warp. So the first thing I'm gonna do is just to help secure, and it will get easier. I know working with all of this thread to begin with can kind of be troublesome, but it's not so much that it's going to get particularly tangly or anything like that. So I've done I've gave it one twist. I'm going to come back with my shuttle, and I'm just going to make sure I give it another twist and then pull it through again. And this is just going to help make sure that our yarn isn't going to go anywhere or shift too much, because when you're working on a loom, you really have to think about the tension that you're using. So I've given it a good, you can see it's sort of twisted around this first line, and when we're at the stage where we're removing our warp, this is going to be helpful as we're not going to lose any of the tension that we've created. So what I'm going to do now is a basic tabby weave is an over-under on our warp thread. So right now I'm starting off, you can see my orange thread is coming under this white line. So my next step would be to take it, my shuttle is going to go over and then under the next piece, and then over and under, over, under, over, over. And if you mess up at any time, sometimes I get confused myself as I'm going over, under. So that's okay. Just take your time in and making sure you're going over under correctly. And once you have your thread worked all the way through, you can give it a pull. This takes a little bit, but like I said, once we've gotten into the process of doing a few of these tabby lines, it'll be a little bit easier to move your thread. So we're going to give it a bit of a pull, and as we reach the end, don't pull too tightly because we don't want to change the tension on our warp. So we're just going to give it a bit of a tug, and once you've completed that first line of over under, you've completed your first line of tabby weaving. All right, so to continue, now that you're at the other side of your loom, what you're going to do is you can take your shuttle and you can go, so your last line you finished over, you can take your shuttle and start by going over. And then basically what you're doing is just repeating the same process of under, over, under, over. And just make sure that whatever is below, whatever your first tabby weave is the opposite of what you're doing on top here. So just to give you an example, I'll finish this line as quickly as I can. And I'll give it a pull. If at any point you get any tangles, that's okay. Just take your time. It's nice with this chunky yarn is that most of these knots and tangles won't stick around for too long. And you can work, I feel most comfortable when I'm working with my loom just flat on the table. But if at any point you feel like you need to pick your loom up and hold it at an angle or anything like that, please feel free to do so, whatever is going to be most comfortable for you. All right, so I finished my second line, and as you can see, it's alternating from my first line. And so this tabby weave is the basic weave that's used in all loom techniques and is pretty traditional in most fabrics. So what I am going to encourage everybody to do is do maybe four to six lines of the tabby weave, going over, under, back and forth. And then I'm going to do the same. I'm going to complete maybe 6 lines, and then we'll get right back and I'll show you some different techniques. All right, so what I've done is I've done about 5 or 6 lines of tabby weaving, and as you can see, you're starting to build up a really lovely surface with your weft material. So one thing I'd like to introduce after you've done some regular lines of tabby weaving is we're going to start reducing the number of warp threads that we incorporate. So this would be considered a reduced weave. And when you do this, you're going to create some really interesting shapes on the surface of your weaving. It's very simple. All you have to do is find the end of your weft thread. And so just like the tabby weave, I'm going to start with my over under. And as I'm going through, I am going to, just going to give it a bit of a pull. Sometimes it's a little bit easier, just like that. And so if you're like me, I like to put a lot of tension on my weft thread, and you'll notice that my warp is starting to pull into the center. Try and just relax that tension a bit with your fingers. Now, anytime you notice any spacing down here with your tabby weave, you can just take your fingertips and give it a gentle pull, and this is going to compress your weave and give you a little bit of a tighter texture. So that's just some of the choices that you can make while you're weaving. If you're like me and you don't use your shuttle, I'm constantly losing the end of my thread, but that's okay. It's not like we're dealing with too much material here. So I'm just going to keep going with my over under. And as you can see, as I come to the last warp threads here, I'm actually going to stop right here at this third one. I'm gonna loop my weft under. I'll give it a pull. So as you can see, I've stopped. I'm going to loop my thread around this warp here. And what that's going to do is that's going to start giving shape to this tabby weave that I'm doing. So once you're doing this, don't worry about how we're gonna fill in this space. It's not going to affect our weave at all. Once we remove our piece from our loom, our cardboard loom, you'll be surprised that this is going to maintain sort of its shape and design. As you do some reduce weaving, you'll notice that we can fill it in with our other weft, or we can go and pick up some of our really lovely sort of chunky wool and roving, and we can explore some other techniques. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go back and forth a few times. So I'll do one full tabby weave, I'll come back and do another, stopping at this third thread, and then come back. And as I'm going back, I'm gonna try and reduce 2 threads every once in a while. And so I'm gonna create sort of a triangular shape with my orange thread. Let me give you a bit of an example. So sometimes I know talking about weaving and all of its terminology can get a little tricky, but that's okay. It's just, it takes a little bit of time to learn the over-under process and to sort of get into a rhythm with it. But once you have that established, you can do some really amazing things just with thread and just on this really simple loom. All right. So as you can see, I've reduced my tabby weave, and I'm just gonna keep going. I'll do one more pass. And again, I'm gonna stop right here at this third piece. I'll pull it through. So once I'm at the end here, I'll go back one last time. If at any point you feel like the space between your bridges is getting too full, like I said, just take your fingertips and you can compress your weaving just like that, and that will give you more space to work. And so I've done 2 passes with my first reduction. And so now when I want to move to my second reduction, I'll just start the tabby weave like normal with my over under. But instead of going all the way out, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm going to stop at this 5th thread. I'm going to weave it under. I'll pull all my weft through, just taking my time. Oh, that's okay. Most of the time you won't get any knots, it'll just be tangles. So once that's all done, I'll tamp down with my fingers. I'll just keep working through like that. And so I've reduced my thread even further, so I'm going to weave here, and I'm going to keep going until I've created a triangle, and I'll pick back up when I've reached the very end of my thread, and I'll show you how to tie off. All right, so as you can see, I've been reducing my tabby weave all the way down till I've reached my top bridge here. You can see I have quite a lot of leftover thread, but that's okay. I'm gonna teach you how to tie off. So as we're working through the weaving, anytime you wanna change threads, the best recommendation I can make is that you always, when you want to tie off your thread, you're always going to tie off ideally on an end piece. So as you can see, I just have one little bit more, one more pass to make. And as you get up to the top of your bridge, what I like to do is just use my fingertips and compress my weave just a little bit. When you do this, you'll notice, see right here where I have sort of a larger piece of the warp coming through. I can see here I made a mistake with my over under, but that's okay, that's nothing to worry about. It won't affect the integrity of your weave at all, it's just a little bit of an irregularity in the pattern. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make sure that my weft thread is all the way at the end. As I pull it through, I'm going to be concerned about this, just this last final piece of thread here. So currently I'm over it. I'm going to give it one wrap. And so what I like to do is I like to give it, so you can see I've made a loop. I'm just going to pass through, basically like I'm just tying a very simple knot at the end. You want to just be careful with this that you're not pulling too hard or adding too much pressure to your weave. So what I'm going to do is just very gently pull through, make a small knot. That's going to help secure my weft. And what I'm going to do, now that I'm done with this color, I'll take it and I'll pass it through the back here. And if you have a spare set of scissors on hand, because I do have quite a bit of leftover material here, I'll just take my scissors and give it a little bit of a snip. Well, these scissors aren't very sharp, but you'll just give it a bit of a snip, and then you can hold on to this leftover material if you decide to, if you want to add more weaving along the top, you can by all means do that. But now what we'll move on to is we'll explore some of our heavier yarns with a few different weaving techniques that's going to add more texture to your surface. So our next step is going to be creating a different kind of weaving technique. So what I've done is I've laid out the four colors, but two different lengths of thicker wool that I have. So we're going to start with the two pieces that are a little bit longer. I'm going to pick up this green, but you can choose between this sort of lovely green brown or this navy color. I'm going to go with my green. I'll just set these aside for now. And what we're going to do is a kind of weaving technique called a sumac. And so where our tabby weave is nice and regular and it's giving a pretty flat, consistent surface, a sumac weave is going to add a lot of lovely texture to our little weaving here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this long piece, and I'm going to start just at the bottom here, again starting on my left hand side. I'm going to take a length of it, just pick up my first two pieces of warp and just slide it underneath. We're going to work on incorporating the tail. We're going to sort of hide that in our weaving process. So you don't have to worry about that sticking up, but just try and get it to sit underneath maybe the first two or the first four pieces of warp. You can push that down. So with the sumac weave, it's a little bit different from the regular over under that we've practiced before. So we have our first 2 pieces of warp here that we've tucked our tail under. I'm gonna give it just a little bit of a pull, and I'm gonna take this, I'm gonna take the end, and if you notice at any point it's becoming separated, just give it a little bit of a twist to get it back together. I'm gonna take my wool, and I'm just gonna loop it around my first 2 pieces of warp. And then I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna move to the next 2 pieces. Don't pull too tight. Again, we don't wanna change too much of the tension. But with this, to weave this end in, I'm gonna try and pick up the 2 pieces of warp and that little last piece of wool. And I'm gonna pull that over. And you can see I'm creating a really lovely texture here. I love the contrast of the sumac with the tabby weaving. Just because it's going to give you a lot of play in height and texture. So I'm going to keep going along, keep picking up those 2 pieces of warp, and then just making a loop, sliding it down. Don't forget to, if you're wanting to adjust, just use your fingertips, give it a bit of an adjustment. I'm gonna give it a bit of a pull, just to tighten up the surface just a little bit. And I'm going to keep going, following this diagonal that I made when I was reducing my tabby weave. And so again, I'm just repeating, going 2, 2, and then over the last 2. So let me just finish that up right here. Giving it a bit of a pull. And see my wool is coming a little bit separated, so I'll just give it a bit of a twist, and I'm gonna just loop it under my last 2 pieces here. And to tie off this piece, I have my loop. I know it's difficult to see, but I have some space underneath this last weave that I'm just gonna try and take. It's like tying a knot, and just tucking in that last little bit, that last little edge. And that's gonna be your very first sumac weave. So I'm gonna repeat the process with my navy, and I'll come right back because you'll see this piece is a little bit longer, so we can talk about doing a sumac weave and then a reverse weave. All right, so what I've done is I've done a double sumac. So I've done my first one in this green brown wool, and then my second one in my lovely navy. So if you're looking to do a reverse sumac stitch, it's very simple. I'm gonna take one of my pieces of shorter wool. I think I'm gonna go, at this point you can make a decision. I think I'm gonna go for this soft gray. And it's exactly how you started on your left-hand side, but you're gonna move to your right. And you're gonna make a little bit of a loop. As you can see, I'm working on a diagonal, and if I'm getting up, my wool is getting up to my bridge, I can just take my fingers, give it a bit of a compress down, because sometimes once you're working up this far, it gets a little bit difficult to manipulate the wool through your warp. So you can just compress it. You don't have to worry about your weaving being particularly large. Remember, this is just an experiment. This is just practice. So to do a reverse sumac, we're just going to start on the right hand side where we would typically start on the left. And I'm going to do just exactly as I did before. I'm going to loop under. Because this piece of wool is a little bit shorter, I'm going to work with my tail shorter as well. So I'm going to give my first loop along my right hand piece of warp. And don't worry, I know sometimes this gets a little tricky as we're dealing with more and more fiber. So I'm going to give it a pull, and I can see I've undone my little knot here for my previous one, but that's okay. It's really nice and easy just to pull it through and then tuck those tails in. So we're back to where we started. And I'm going to go through, and I'm going to do 2. Just remember, start going over the thread. I know sometimes I get confused too, and I just got to take a moment. We're going to go under, pull it up over, just very patiently. We're going to do another loop of 2, just like we did with the first 2 sumacs, but just going in the opposite direction. And we're going to do 2. Now, because this piece of yarn is a little bit short, we're going to get about halfway through our loom here, but that's okay. I'm going to just tamp it down. And so now we have a choice to make. So we have our tabby weave and our sumac, and we have some leftover materials. I have this lovely beige color, and I also have my sort of creamy white weft left, as well as a little bit of leftover orange. So I'm gonna leave the decision of how to fill this space up to you. What I think I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go back in with my orange thread. And if you wanna continue on tabby weaving, what I would recommend doing is you can start, I recommend always starting on the left-hand side and working your way across. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start from the very top, and it's basically exactly like we started with this tabby weave. I'm gonna take a little bit, pull it through. I know sometimes this gets tricky, but that's okay. I'm gonna work with the remainder of my thread, or you can pick up a new color. And exactly as I did before, I'm gonna come down here to where my bridge starts, because this is gonna give me a line as to where my sumac weave leaves off. And so I'm gonna do a little bit of a knot, just a couple loops just to make sure it's secure. So I have a good wrap around on that. I do my best to pull it taut, but not too tight. You're playing with the tension here, and as you work more, you'll sort of figure out what's going to be comfortable for you. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do my tabby weave. Maybe if I squish this down just a little bit more, I can get a couple, maybe 2 or 3 lines of tabby weave. And then I'm gonna reduce my weave here, just like we did along the bottom. So once I have all of that finished, I'll come back and I'll show you how to take your beautiful weaving off your loom. So I've completed my other half of my tabby weave. I've squeezed as much as I could in above my sumac here. So if at any time you notice you have any little areas sort of popping out or little tails, you can just work with your fingertips to sort of tuck those in. So now that we have our weaving surface full, I'm going to show you how to carefully and safely remove your weaving from your loom. So this is a slow process, but it is fairly simple. I'm gonna start at my top left this time. I'm gonna take my loom and flip it over. So you can see I have a tail, and then I have this little bit of crossover here. So what I like to do is just with my finger, I'll just bend open so I can pull up my tail, and then this little crossover of warp, I'm gonna pull that off. And don't worry that it's hanging loose. I'm just gonna leave it like that for now. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do the same thing to the piece next to it. Just gonna give that cardboard just a little bit of a bend. And don't worry if you'd like to reuse your loom at any time. These little bends in the cardboard aren't gonna affect it at all. We're just gonna very carefully pull up. It can get a little tricky because it really gets stuck in these grooves. But don't worry, just take your time. And so I have my first 2 pieces off of my loom. And so what I'm gonna do very carefully is I'm gonna take these 2 little pieces of warp, and I'm gonna tie them together. And this is just tying off all of your ends, so none of your weft is going to pull away or come up. So what I like to do, I like to double knot it. 2. Just like that. So we have our little ends there, and we also have this little tail. With that, you can just tuck it behind, or sometimes what I like to do, it's a little tricky to see, but if you can see some areas where your weft is a little bit loose, you can always take it and just tuck it into one of these stitches. Just work very carefully with your fingertips on pulling that through, just so you don't disturb your front pattern that you have happening. But just give it a little bit of a pull up, and you can tuck it right behind. Just because I don't like cutting off too much if I have a little bit of excess material here and there, just because you run the risk of if your knot isn't good or anything like that, then you're going to run the risk of your weave unraveling. So I'm just going to repeat the same process. I'm going to take this tab down and just pop that warp up, or yep, that warp up. And like I said, just take your time with this because it really is nice and secure in there. It takes a little bit of work, but that's okay. And you're going to repeat this process all the way across, removing 2 at a time, and then tying them off just like we did before with a double knot, just very carefully. And so you can do the same thing with these edge pieces too. Let me just get another knot in here and I can give you a little example of it. So I'm doing my best to tie these off. There's one knot. Here's the other. And then to make sure these are hidden, you can just tuck them back into your weave, just very carefully, and those are going to disappear for you. So once you have everything tied off and tucked away behind, you're going to repeat the same process for the bottom, and you're going to have a beautiful complete weaving with 2 different weaving techniques. I hope you enjoyed this project, and we'll see you next month.